On March 29, 1961, the 23rd Amendment was ratified, granting residents of Washington, D.C. the right to vote in presidential elections. For the first time since the district's creation, Americans living in the nation's capital could help choose their president. This amendment addressed a glaring democratic deficit that had existed since 1800, when the federal government moved to Washington. The story of the 23rd Amendment begins with the Constitution itself. Article 1, Section 8 gave Congress authority to create a federal district to serve as the nation's capital. The framers wanted the seat of government to be independent of any state, preventing any single state from exerting undue influence over federal institutions. In 1790, Congress accepted land from Maryland and Virginia to create a 10-mile square federal district. The nation's capital moved from Philadelphia to Washington in 1800, but this created an unexpected problem. Residents of the new District of Columbia lost their right to vote in federal elections. They were no longer citizens of Maryland or Virginia, and the district itself had no representation in Congress or the Electoral College. For decades, this wasn't seen as a major problem because relatively few people lived in Washington. Most residents were government officials who maintained legal residence in their home states and voted there. The district was essentially just government buildings and those who worked in them. But Washington grew. By the Civil War, tens of thousands of permanent residents lived in the district. People who worked in businesses, raised families, and called Washington home. They paid federal taxes, served in the military when called, and obeyed all federal laws. Yet they couldn't vote for president or have voting representation in Congress. After World War II, Washington's population exceeded 800,000, larger than many states. These Americans were subject to federal authority, but had no voice in choosing federal leaders. The injustice became increasingly obvious. As Senator Estes Kefauver of Tennessee said, "The residents of the District of Columbia are the only people in the free world who are taxed by a national government, but are denied the right to vote for the officials of that government." The push for D.C. voting rights gained momentum in the 1950s, driven by several factors. The civil rights movement highlighted voting rights generally, and Washington's majority black population made D.C. disenfranchisement particularly troubling. Cold War competition with the Soviet Union created pressure. How could America claim to champion democracy worldwide while denying it to residents of its own capital? Senator Kefauver introduced the 23rd Amendment resolution in 1959. The amendment was carefully limited in scope. It didn't grant D.C. statehood, give it voting representation in Congress, or make it fully equal to states. It simply allowed district residents to vote for president and vice president. The amendment specified that D.C. would have a number of electors of president and vice president equal to the whole number of senators and representatives in Congress to which the district would be entitled if it were a state, but in no event more than the least populous state. This meant D.C. would have 3 electoral votes, the minimum any state could have, even though its population might justify more. Congress approved the amendment on June 16, 1960. The Senate voted 70 to 18 and the House 294 to 86. Support came primarily from Northern Democrats and moderate Republicans. Southern Democrats largely opposed it, concerned that D.C.'s black majority would gain political power. Ratification moved swiftly. Hawaii was first, ratifying on June 23, 1960, just days after congressional approval. State after state followed. On March 29, 1961, Ohio became the 38th state to ratify, surpassing the 3/4 requirement. Kansas's ratification the same day provided confirmation. Interestingly, 11 states never ratified the 23rd Amendment. These were primarily southern states that opposed expanding voting rights. Arkansas, Florida, Georgia, Kentucky, Louisiana, Mississippi, Oklahoma, South Carolina, Texas, and Virginia. Delaware also failed to ratify. This pattern reveals how voting rights remained contested along regional and racial lines even in the 1960s. The amendment took effect immediately for the 1964 presidential election. For the first time in 164 years, Washington, D.C., residents could vote for president. They cast their 3 electoral votes for Lyndon Johnson, beginning a pattern that continues today. D.C. has voted Democratic in every presidential election since gaining the franchise. The 23rd Amendment's impact was significant but limited. District residents gained the right to vote for president, but they still lacked voting representation in Congress. In 1970, D.C. gained one non-voting delegate in the House of Representatives, but this provided only minimal voice in federal legislation. The amendment also created an anomaly. D.C. has more population than Wyoming or Vermont, but only 3 electoral votes, while those states have 3 and 3 respectively. If electoral votes were allocated purely by population, D.C. might have 4 or 5. The amendment's cap at the minimum state allocation meant D.C. remained somewhat underrepresented even in presidential elections. Critics of the 23rd Amendment have been few, but some constitutional scholars note it creates unusual situations. D.C. votes for president, but doesn't control its own local government. Congress retained ultimate authority over the district. This means D.C. residents help choose who governs America, but have limited say in who governs their own city. Supporters respond that the amendment was a crucial step toward democratic equality, even if incomplete. Giving 800,000 Americans the vote, even partially, was progress. The alternative, maintaining complete disenfranchisement, was indefensible. The 23rd Amendment sparked ongoing debates about D.C.'s status. If district residents can vote for president, why not also have voting representatives in Congress? In 1978, Congress proposed a D.C. voting rights amendment that would have treated D.C. as a state for representation purposes, but it failed to achieve ratification before its deadline expired. Today, debates continue about D.C. statehood. Proponents argue that over 700,000 Americans living in D.C. deserve full representation in Congress, not just presidential voting rights. Opponents counter that the framers intended the capital to be independent of any state, and full statehood would violate that principle. The 23rd Amendment teaches several lessons. First, that democratic principles require extending voting rights to all citizens, subject to government authority. Taxation without representation is fundamentally unjust, whether by a distant king or by the citizen's own government. Second, the amendment shows that constitutional reform can happen incrementally. Complete D.C. equality proved impossible politically, but partial reform, presidential voting rights, was achievable. Sometimes partial progress is better than no progress. Third, the amendment demonstrates that the Constitution can adapt to changing circumstances. When Washington was created, few anticipated it would become a major city with hundreds of thousands of permanent residents. When this happened, the amendment process allowed democratic principles to be extended to this new population. Most importantly, the 23rd Amendment reminds us that voting rights are fundamental to human dignity and democratic participation. People who live under government authority, pay taxes, and obey laws deserve a voice in choosing their leaders. This principle seems obvious, yet it took 161 years to partially extend it to Washington, D.C. residents. As we reflect on the 23rd Amendment, we're challenged to think about ongoing questions of representation and democracy. The amendment solved one problem, but left others unresolved. D.C. residents still lack voting representation in Congress. Is this acceptable in a democratic republic? How should we balance the framers' vision of an independent capital with the modern reality of a large permanent population deserving representation? These questions don't have easy answers, but the 23rd Amendment at least took a significant step toward ensuring that Americans living in their nation's capital could participate in choosing who leads that nation. It's an imperfect solution to a complex problem, but it moved America closer to its founding ideal that government should rest on the consent of the governed, all the governed.